Imagine spending years building a wall, brick by brick, lie by lie, distraction by distraction, and then watching it crumble in a single week. Not because your enemies tore it down, but because the very people who helped you build it picked up sledgehammers and started swinging. That is exactly what is happening right now in American politics. The story that was never supposed to surface, the names that were never supposed to be spoken aloud in connection, the files that powerful men spent millions trying to bury, they are out. And the political earthquake that is following in their wake is shaking the foundations of the Republican Party, the Trump administration, and the broader American power structure in ways that nobody, not even the most seasoned political observers, fully anticipated. This is not a story about Jeffrey Epstein alone. It never really was. It is a story about power, protection, silence, and the fragile architecture of political loyalty. It is a story about what happens when a narrative that has been carefully constructed over years suddenly collapses under the weight of its own contradictions. And it is a story about this moment, when members of Donald Trump's own party began to publicly distance themselves from a president they once treated as untouchable. To understand how we arrived here, we need to go back. Not just weeks or months, but years. Jeffrey Epstein was not simply a wealthy financier with questionable social habits. He was, by every credible account, the operator of one of the most extensive and disturbing networks of exploitation and blackmail that the modern world has ever seen. He moved through elite circles with extraordinary ease: Wall Street, Hollywood, European royalty, Silicon Valley, and the highest levels of American political life. His private island, his fleet of aircraft, his multiple residences, they were not just symbols of excess, they were instruments, tools of access, leverage, and control. Epstein was first arrested in 2006 in Florida. What followed became one of the most controversial legal decisions in recent American history. Federal prosecutors, working under then United States Attorney Alexander Acosta, entered into a non-prosecution agreement with Epstein that effectively shielded him, and, critically, any co-conspirators, from federal charges. Epstein pleaded guilty to state charges, served only 13 months in a county jail with extraordinary work release privileges, and was allowed to return to his life of wealth and influence. Victims were not notified. Justice was not served. And the names of those who had participated in Epstein's network remained protected behind layers of legal confidentiality. For over a decade that arrangement held. Epstein continued to move freely. He continued to socialize with presidents, princes, and billionaires. And the machinery of silence continued to operate. But in 2018, investigative journalist Julie Brown published a groundbreaking series in the Miami Herald that tore the lid off the sweetheart deal and reignited public outrage. Within a year, federal authorities in New York arrested Epstein again, this time on charges of sex trafficking that carried the potential for decades in prison. The world waited for what many believed would be the trial of the century, the trial that would finally force powerful men to answer uncomfortable questions. It never came. On August 10, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. The official ruling was suicide by hanging, but almost immediately, that conclusion was met with profound skepticism, not just from conspiracy theorists on the fringes of the internet, but from forensic pathologists, legal experts, and sitting members of Congress. The circumstances were deeply troubling. Surveillance cameras had malfunctioned. Guards had fallen asleep. Epstein had been removed from suicide watch just days before his death. The medical examiner hired by Epstein's legal team concluded that the evidence was more consistent with homicide than suicide. And the question that has never fully been answered, who benefited most from Jeffrey Epstein never taking the stand, has hung over American public life ever since. Now fast forward to the present. In recent months, a series of legal battles, court orders, and investigative disclosures have forced the release of documents, deposition transcripts, and records connected to the Epstein case that had been sealed for years. And what those documents contain, the names, the communications, the travel logs, the patterns of behavior, has created a political firestorm unlike almost anything seen in modern American history. Because among the names appearing with uncomfortable frequency in this newly surfaced material is Donald Trump. To be precise about what the evidence shows and does not show is essential here. Donald Trump has never been charged with any crime related to Jeffrey Epstein. He has denied any wrongdoing emphatically and repeatedly. But the documented relationship between Trump and Epstein is extensive, goes back decades, and stands in direct contradiction to the narrative that Trump and his allies have tried to construct. Trump himself, in a now widely circulated 2002 interview with New York Magazine, described Epstein as a terrific guy who enjoyed the company of younger women. Flight logs and social records placed Trump in proximity to Epstein's world on multiple documented occasions. And former Epstein associate Ghislaine Maxwell, currently serving a 20-year federal prison sentence for her role in the sex trafficking operation, has made statements, some in sealed proceedings, some in interviews, that have added new dimensions to the public understanding of who knew what and when. What changed the political dynamic most dramatically was not any single document or revelation in isolation, it was the accumulation. It was the pattern. And it was the moment that Trump, sensing the political danger, attempted to get ahead of the story with a counter-narrative that quickly and publicly fell apart. In statements and social media posts, Trump and his surrogates attempted to reframe the Epstein story as a Democratic scandal, pointing to the Clintons, pointing to other prominent figures associated with the left, and attempting to position Trump himself as someone who had actually tried to expose Epstein and assist law enforcement. That framing began circulating through right-wing media ecosystems with enormous velocity, and for a period of time, it gained significant traction. But then the documents caught up with the narrative. Investigators, journalists, and legal analysts began systematically cross-referencing the claims being made by Trump allies against the actual documentary record, and the gaps between what was being claimed and what the evidence showed were not subtle, they were glaring. Timelines did not match. Statements contradicted records. Claims of cooperation with law enforcement were disputed by people who had been directly involved in those investigations. One by one, the pillars of the counter-narrative were knocked down, and in real time, on television screens and social media feeds across the country, the story that Trump's team had been telling began to visibly collapse.